Picture the absolute terror of a 16-year-old boy. The year is 1613. And he's hiding out behind these thick stone walls of a monastery, just weeping uncontrollably.
Right.
A delegation of these powerful, heavily armed nobles has just arrived at the gates, and they haven't come to kill him. They've actually come to tell him that he has been chosen to rule over this completely fractured, bleeding, chaotic nation.
It was a terrifying moment.
Yeah, and he's begging his mother to protect him because he knows that accepting this crown is basically signing his own death warrant. And the name of the sanctuary where this terrified teenager is hiding, it's the Ipatiev Monastery.
It really is a striking image. And, when you fast forward exactly 304 years, the historical symmetry becomes genuinely chilling.
Oh, absolutely. You
Yeah.
jump forward 3 centuries to the dead of night, and there's another terrified group huddled together. But this time, it's a deposed ruler, his wife, their hemophiliac son, and their 4 daughters. They're trapped in this cramped, claustrophobic cellar, listening to the heavy boots of their captors moving around upstairs. And it's the violent, bloody end of their dynasty. The building they've been exiled to, the place where they take their final breaths, is a requisitioned merchant's property called the Ipatiev House.
Right. So they began in Ipatiev and they ended in Ipatiev.
Exactly.
That kind of narrative bookend is something a novelist would probably reject for being, way too heavy-handed. But history often has a morbid sense of poetry.
It really does.
The trajectory from that monastery in 1613 to that cellar in 1918 is one of the most complex, brutal, and, fascinating arcs in all of human governance.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a massive stack of historical sources. We're pulling from comprehensive encyclopedias, specialized academic databases, intimate biographies, and even some forensic genealogical records.
We've got a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. We're using all of this material to unpack the 300-year saga of the House of Romanov. Our mission today, for you listening, is to explore the central historical tension of this legendary dynasty.
Right.
Like, how did they emerge from a state of total anarchy to seize supreme power? Once they had it, how did they justify their iron-fisted absolute rule over millions of people for centuries?
And we also want to dissect the fatal intersection of institutional rot and deeply personal family tragedy that triggered their spectacular downfall.
Yes, exactly. To do this effectively, we're going to be looking at this story through 2 very distinct lenses. I'll be tackling the human element, the family dynamics, the bizarre personalities, the genetic curses, and the massive cultural symbolism of the dynasty.
This is super important.
Yeah, because you cannot understand the Russian Empire without understanding the intense, insulated, and sometimes just completely unhinged family that sat at its center.
Very true. And I'm going to focus on the raw mechanics of it all. So the institutional structures, the shifting legal codes, the economic realities, and the often brutal machinations of state power that kept the Romanov machine running.
The gears behind the curtain.
Right, because we have to look at how empires are actually built and sustained on paper and, through force.
You are going to hear about a family that built a sprawling modern empire, but in the end, they were completely devoured by the very machine they created.
We're going to journey from the muddy, fiercely competitive origins of medieval Russian nobility through the sweeping modernization of figures like Peter and Catherine the Great into the crushing pressure cooker of 19th century autocracy.
And finally to that devastating collapse in the 20th century. Prepare for a story involving empire building, peasant mystics, violent revolutions, and a level of wealth so staggering it literally breaks the modern brain to quantify.
Oh, the wealth is just absurd. And the documented truth of this family is far wilder than any of the animated movies or myths you might have grown up with.
Let's start by unpacking the origins. Where did the Romanovs actually come from? If you dive into the genealogical sources, they didn't just, drop out of the sky as royalty.
No, not at all.
They share their roots with about 24 other Russian noble families, all tracing back to a man named Andrei Kobila, who shows up in the historical record around the year 1347.
Right, so Andrei Kobila is attested as a boyar. And for context for you listening, the boyars were basically the highest echelon of the Russian aristocracy at the time.
The elite of the elite.
Exactly. They were the elite landowners and military commanders serving the Grand Prince of Vladimir and later the Grand Princes of Moscow. What's deeply fascinating about Kobila is the myth-making apparatus that surrounds him later on.
Oh, yeah, the PR campaign.
Seriously. As the Romanovs consolidated supreme power, their 18th century genealogists felt this massive pressure to assign their founder a truly illustrious pedigree. You couldn't just have an ordinary nobleman at the root of a divine autocracy.
Yeah.
So they started claiming he was the son of a prominent old Prussian prince named Glanda Kambila, who supposedly fled to Russia to escape invading German knights.
Because if you are the unquestioned rulers of a massive empire, you absolutely want your ancestors to sound like epic, displaced royalty. You don't want them to sound like a guy whose last name, Kobila, literally translates to mare or horse.
Yeah, that doesn't quite have the same ring to it.
Some of the more grounded historical sources suggest he might not have been a prince at all, but rather the master of horse in the royal household, which is, a very prestigious administrative job, but certainly not royal blood.
Definitely not.
And you can see how the family name shifted over the generations as they tried to refine their image. From Kobila, one of his sons earned the nickname Koshka, meaning cat. So for a while, the family was known as the Koshkins.
From horses to cats.
Right. Then they became the Zakharins, then the Yuryevs. It wasn't until the grandchildren of a patriarch named Roman Yurevich that they finally locked in the name Romanov.
But having a strong noble name is one thing. It doesn't grant you supreme authority. They were high-ranking, wealthy boyars, sure, but they were operating in a system entirely dominated by the Rurik dynasty.
The big bosses.
Yeah, the Ruriks had held power for 700 years. They were the established, unquestioned masters of the realm. The critical pivot point for the Romanovs, the moment they truly entered the dangerous upper atmosphere of supreme power, was facilitated through marriage.
And what a marriage it was. In 1547, a young woman named Anastasia Romanovna marries Ivan IV. This is the monarch history vividly remembers as Ivan the Terrible.
The one and only.
He had just taken the unprecedented step of assuming the title Tsar of all Russia, elevating himself above a mere grand prince. That makes Anastasia the very first Tsaritsa.
Which is a massive leap in status for the family.
Huge. And the sources consistently emphasize that she had an incredibly grounding, calming influence on him. Ivan had a famously volatile, explosive temperament, but as long as Anastasia was by his side, his more extreme, violent tendencies were largely kept in check. They had a genuine bond.
Which is precisely why her sudden death in 1560 was not just a personal tragedy. It was a geopolitical catastrophe for the Russian state.
It really was.
Ivan was entirely shattered by her loss, and that profound grief rapidly mutated into an intense, all-consuming paranoia. He became convinced, without immediate proof at the time, that the other jealous boyar families had poisoned his beloved wife to weaken him.
He just snapped.
He did. This suspicion fundamentally altered the trajectory of his reign and the state apparatus. In response to his paranoia, Ivan launched the Oprichnina.
Which was basically a state-sponsored reign of terror, right?
Exactly. A horrific reign of terror against his own nobility. He effectively cleaved the country in two, creating a state within a state. He utilized a fiercely loyal, terrifying secret police force called the Oprichniki.
Oh, these guys were wild.
They famously rode with dog heads and brooms attached to their saddles to symbolize sniffing out and sweeping away treason. They were used to purge, torture, and confiscate the lands of anyone he remotely suspected of disloyalty.
Now, for centuries, the prevailing historical consensus was that Ivan was simply a deeply unstable, paranoid tyrant using his wife's death as an excuse to crush the nobility. But here is where the science in our sources gets incredibly compelling.
This is fascinating.
In the early 2000s, researchers were finally able to conduct forensic analysis on Anastasia's remains. They tested her hair and her bones, and they found massively elevated, lethal levels of mercury.
It is a stunning historical vindication. Ivan's crippling paranoia, the very thing that led him to shatter the administrative stability of his own state, was likely entirely justified.
She was murdered.
Yeah, the boyars, or some faction within them, had actually poisoned the Tsaritsa.
And the fallout from that single act of poisoning effectively destroys the 700-year-old Rurik dynasty. Ivan, consumed by the lingering madness and violence of his own reign, famously strikes and kills his own highly capable eldest son and heir in a fit of absolute rage.
Terrible mistake.
So, when Ivan finally dies, the throne defaults to his younger son, Fyodor I. Fyodor is described across the sources as deeply pious, perhaps intellectually disabled, and entirely lethargic when it came to statecraft. Crucially, Fyodor dies childless in 1598.
And just like that, a ruling family that had governed for 7 centuries is extinct.
Poof, gone.
To understand the institutional horror of that moment, you have to realize that the death of a 700-year-old dynasty without a clear, designated blood heir is the ultimate nightmare scenario for an autocratic system.
Because everything is tied to the bloodline.
Exactly. The entire concept of law, order, and divine favor is tied to the physical bloodline of the monarch. When that bloodline vanishes, the authority of the state vanishes with it. Russia immediately plunges into a period aptly named the Time of Troubles.
That sounds ominous.
It was worse than ominous. We're talking about the total breakdown of central authority, severe famines that wiped out perhaps a third of the population, roaming armies of mercenaries, and eventual invasion and occupation by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
It's just total anarchy. And in the midst of this terrifying power vacuum, a man named Boris Godunov maneuvers his way into power. He was Fyodor's brother-in-law and had basically been running the country behind the scenes anyway.
Right.
Godunov manages to get himself crowned Tsar, and almost the minute he has the crown on his head, he turns his sights directly on the Romanov family. He accuses the family patriarch, Fyodor Nikitich Romanov, of plotting treason and using witchcraft against the throne.
Witchcraft was a classic charge.
Always effective. Godunov ruthlessly exiles the entire Romanov clan to the freezing, unforgiving reaches of the Urals in the far north. Many of them starve to death or die in chains. He forces the leader, Fyodor, to take monastic vows, physically shaving his head and forcing him to become a monk named Filaret.
Yeah.
Now, when I read this, I have to wonder, was Godunov just being petty and vindictive, or was this a calculated necessity?
Oh, as a masterclass in ruthless political calculus. You have to put yourself in Godunov's shoes. He is a usurper. He's ruling over a fractured, starving, highly suspicious nation, and his own legal claim to the throne is incredibly shaky.
Right, he's just the brother-in-law.
Exactly. The Romanovs, on the other hand, are the direct cousins of the last legitimate Tsar, Fyodor I, through Ivan the Terrible's marriage to Anastasia. In a political system where legitimacy is currency, the Romanovs are sitting on a gold mine.
They are a massive threat.
Right. In a power vacuum, anyone with a direct blood tie to the last stable, universally recognized regime is a mortal existential threat to the new regime. Godunov wasn't acting out of petty jealousy. He was acting out of survival instinct. He was trying to amputate a threat before it could mobilize.
That makes a lot of sense.
And forcing Fyodor Romanov to become the monk Filaret was a highly specific method of political neutralization. Under Russian Orthodox tradition, a man who has taken strict monastic vows is dead to the secular world. He absolutely cannot hold a secular title or claim a throne.
But that strategy of forced neutralization spectacularly backfires on the Godunov family. Because Godunov dies, his fragile dynasty completely collapses by 1605, and suddenly, being a prominent monk named Filaret isn't a demotion at all. It becomes a bizarrely powerful asset.
It's incredible how that turned around.
As the time of troubles deepens, various warlords and impostors, famously known as the false Dimitris, try to claim the throne by pretending to be Ivan the Terrible's long-lost youngest son. These impostors desperately need legitimacy, so they look to Filaret.
They need his Romanov glow.
Exactly. They elevate him to metropolitan and later to the rank of patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, effectively trying to siphon off his inherent Romanov legitimacy to prop up their own fake regimes.
Which brings us to the first major turning point in our deep dive, the year 1613. The situation has reached a breaking point. A volunteer army has finally managed to expel the Polish occupying forces from Moscow. The National Assembly, known as the Zemsky Sobor, convenes in the capital. This assembly includes boyars, clergy, merchants, and representatives from various towns. They desperately need to select a new ruler to permanently end the time of troubles. They actually offer the crown to several high-ranking, powerful princes from other ancient lineages.
And those princes decline.
Yes.
Because the crown is a poison chalice.
Yes.
I mean, the treasury is empty, the countryside is ravaged, and the last few guys who sat on the throne ended up violently murdered.
Precisely. No established power broker wants to risk their neck. The Zemsky Sobor realizes they cannot select a strong, opinionated leader who will immediately alienate rival factions. They need a blank slate. They need a compromise.
And they find their perfect compromise in a 16-year-old boy, Mikhail Romanov, the son of the monk Filaret. Mikhail and his mother are hiding out at the Ipatiev monastery in Kostroma, hundreds of miles from the carnage of Moscow.
Right, the scene from the very beginning.
The Zemsky Sobor sends a grand delegation to the monastery, and this is the moment we opened with. When the delegation arrives and informs Mikhail that he is the newly elected Tsar of all Russia, he doesn't puff out his chest and accept his destiny. He completely breaks down.
He's terrified.
He weeps in absolute fear and despair. His mother begs the delegation to leave her son alone, arguing that the people of Moscow have a terrible track record of murdering their monarchs. He understands that being Tsar is a massive target on his back.
But from the perspective of the Zemsky Sobor, His terror and his youth make him the ideal candidate. He is acceptable to the old nobility because the Romanovs are an established boyar family.
They know him.
Right, he's acceptable to the powerful, heavily armed Cossacks because his father, Filaret, had interacted with them during the chaotic years. And crucially, because he's an inexperienced teenager, the boyars believe he will be easily manipulated. They think they're installing a puppet.
I was trying to conceptualize how a terrified teenager manages to hold on to a fractured, chaotic country without getting assassinated in his first week. And it reminds me heavily of a modern corporate crisis strategy.
Oh, how so?
Imagine a massive legacy corporation is completely failing. The board of directors has ousted the previous leadership. The stock is in free fall. The shareholders are in full panic mode. To calm everyone down, the board doesn't bring in a radical, disruptive innovator who wants to change the culture.
They want stability.
Exactly. They bring in a CEO who looks, sounds, and acts exactly like the beloved original founder of the company. The entire strategy is to project an illusion of seamless continuity to calm the markets.
That is an excellent analogy for the mechanics of early Romanov rule. Mikhail and his seasoned advisors, and eventually his father, Filaret, who's released from captivity and effectively rules alongside him, did exactly that.
They faked it until they made it.
Basically, they had to manufacture legitimacy from thin air. They did this by heavily emphasizing Mikhail's familial ties to the old Rurikid Tsars, specifically his connection to Anastasia Romanovna. They leaned entirely into tradition.
Right.
They treated the monarchy not as a new political institution, but as a deeply sacred, divinely ordained continuation of the past. Moreover, Mikhail didn't act like a dictator. He constantly sought advice from the Zemsky Sobor on every major issue, from taxation to war.
So he made them feel included.
Exactly. By sharing the immense burden of governance, he made the various factions feel invested in his survival, while simultaneously projecting the outward image of traditional divine right.
And amazingly, it works. She survives. He stabilizes the patient. But it's his son, Alexei I, who takes that stabilized patient and truly institutionalizes the autocracy we associate with the Russian Empire.
Alexei I is arguably one of the most critical figures in understanding the institutional DNA of the Russian state. He rules from 1645 to 1676. He steers the country through massive open riots, salt taxes, copper riots, and protracted wars with Poland and Sweden.
Busy guy.
Very. But his most defining, lasting legacy is a comprehensive legal code enacted in 1649, known as the Sobornoye Uложения. This is the document that fully, legally enshrines and solidifies serfdom in Russia.
To put the weight of that document into perspective for you listening, imagine waking up tomorrow and finding out that the federal government has passed a comprehensive law stating that whatever social class you currently belong to, you are frozen there permanently.
Permanently.
Not only that, but you are physically, legally bound to the specific plot of land you currently live on. You cannot move to another city, you cannot change your profession, and this isn't just a temporary emergency measure. Your children and their children will inherit this exact same frozen status.
Is chilling.
And if you try to run away, there is no statute of limitations on hunting you down and dragging you back.
It was an unimaginably brutal system for the peasantry, effectively reducing millions of people to property. But, you have to analyze the why behind it. From the perspective of the Romanov state, it was a necessary mechanism for sheer survival and control. Well, after the catastrophic demographic and economic collapse of the time of troubles, the state prioritized absolute order, guaranteed taxation, and a reliable system for military conscription above any concept of human liberty.
Right. They needed bodies and money.
Exactly. The nobility needed guaranteed labor to farm their estates so they could afford to serve in the Tsar's military. Freezing the population in place guaranteed a permanent labor force for the nobles and a predictable, unmoving tax base for the Tsar.
It's essentially trading the freedom of the population for the administrative survival of the state.
Exactly. And Alexis extended this demand for absolute obedience into the spiritual realm as well. He oversaw a massive, controversial schism in the Russian Orthodox Church during the Great Moscow Synod.
Over what kind of issues?
The state-backed reforms to standardize church rituals, things as seemingly minor as how many fingers to use when making the sign of the cross or how to spell the name of Jesus. Those who refused to adopt the state-mandated reforms became known as the Old Believers.
And I'm guessing the state didn't take kindly to them.
Not at all. The state persecuted them mercilessly, burning many at the stake. What Alexis and the Romanovs were establishing here was a fundamental principle. The Tsar's authority over both the physical body through serfdom and the immortal soul through state-controlled religion was absolute and unquestionable.
Total control.
Yes, this total centralization of power is the foundation of the rigid autocracy that will eventually break the empire centuries later.
So you have this deeply entrenched, agrarian, incredibly conservative state, which perfectly sets the stage for our next major shift. We move into the era of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. This is where the empire rapidly expands, but ironically, it's also where the actual Romanov bloodline completely frays.
Peter the Great, who rules at the turn of the 18th century until 1725, fundamentally violently changes the trajectory of Russia. He looks at this deeply traditional, isolated, religiously rigid society built by his father and grandfather, and he decides it is entirely inadequate for competing on the world stage.
He wants to modernize.
He decides to drag Russia, kicking and screaming, into a rationalist, Europe-oriented, scientific and militaristic framework. He travels to Western Europe incognito, learns shipbuilding, and comes back obsessed with modernization.
And he forced cultural changes too, right? Like the beards.
Oh, famously. He forces the boyars to shave their traditional long beards, even taxing them if they refuse. He forces them to wear Western clothing. He expands the Tsardom into a massive empire through relentless, exhausting warfare against Sweden.
And then there's the new capital.
Yes. Perhaps most symbolically, he abandons the traditional, deeply orthodox capital of Moscow to build a brand new, European-style capital, St. Petersburg, on a swamp conquered from the Swedes, built largely on the bones of conscripted serfs.
He builds a new world, and then a few decades later, you have Catherine the Great, who takes that world and supercharges it. She actually orchestrates a military coup against her own husband in 1762 to seize power, ushering in a true Russian golden age of massive territorial expansion into Crimea and Poland, and embracing the philosophy of the European Enlightenment.
She was a force of nature.
But here is the massive family secret, the genealogical sleight of hand that the state tried very hard to gloss over. The Romanovs, the family we've been talking about since 1613, they essentially went extinct.
Legally and biologically, the mechanics of this succession are fascinating. The direct, unbroken male line of the Romanov dynasty ended completely in 1730 when Peter II, Peter the Great's grandson, died of smallpox as a teenager on the eve of his wedding.
Wow, just bad luck.
Very bad luck. The female line, the last direct Romanov by blood, ended in 1762 with the death of Empress Elizabeth, Peter the Great's daughter.
So who is Catherine's husband, the guy she overthrew to become Catherine the Great, Peter III? If you trace his lineage, he was actually an agnatic member of the House of Holstein-Gottorp, which is a cadet branch of a German noble house.
Right.
And Catherine herself wasn't a drop Russian. She was a German princess born in Stettin, part of the Kingdom of Prussia, into the House of Ascania.
From an institutional standpoint, this presents a massive crisis of legitimacy. The state simply could not afford to lose the Romanov brand. The mystical legitimacy built by Mikhail and Alexis, the awe inspired by Peter the Great, it was too valuable an asset to discard just because the biology failed.
So what did they do?
The state engaged in a massive legal and cultural rebranding. The monarchs who ruled from Peter III onward are officially, culturally, and legally designated as the House of Romanov. But genealogically, in the strict European royal tradition, they are the House of Holstein-Gottorp-Romanov.
A bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, but they justified this continuity by heavily emphasizing their matrilineal descent. Peter III was the son of Peter the Great's other daughter, Anna. It's a powerful testament to how crucial the mere idea of the Romanovs had become to the Russian state's identity. The name itself was the pillar holding up the empire.
So Catherine rules as this absolute powerhouse, a true autocrat. But her son, Paul I, has a very different experience of power. He succeeds her in 1796. The biographical sources paint a picture of a man painfully aware of the hazards of Russian succession.
Oh, he was terrified.
He grew up alienated from his mother, watching her rule after having overthrown and likely authorized the murder of his presumed father. Furthermore, court rumors constantly insinuated that Catherine's early lover, Sergei Saltykov, was Paul's actual biological father.
The gossip was relentless.
Paul is deeply paranoid. He is terrified of the shadowy court intrigue, the powerful guard regiments, and the chaotic coups that entirely defined his mother's era.
This deep-seated fear drives Paul to utilize the only tool he has, legislation. He seeks to control the chaos through bureaucracy. In 1797, he enacts the Pauline Laws. These became some of the strictest, most inflexible house laws governing royal succession in all of Europe.
How strict are we talking?
Very. Paul decreed a system of semi-salic primogeniture. This meant the throne was automatically passed to the eldest male heir and then down the male lines. Females could only inherit the throne if every single male dynastic line was completely, utterly extinct.
He really didn't want another Catherine the Great.
Absolutely not. He wanted to ensure there would never be another Empress Elizabeth or Catherine seizing power. Though laws also strictly mandated that the monarch and their heirs must belong to the Orthodox faith.
And there were rules about who they could marry, right?
Yes. Crucially, later additions to these laws required that royal consorts must be of equal birth, meaning an heir could only marry someone born to a currently reigning sovereign dynasty.
So Paul sits down and tries to legally engineer a completely coup-proof, predictable system. He tries to bulletproof the monarchy with extreme paperwork. I have to ask, does this elaborate mechanism work?
The historical irony is incredibly stark. Paul enacted these rigid laws specifically to bring unshakable safety and stability to the throne and to his own person. In 1801, barely 4 years into his reign, he was brutally murdered in his own bedroom in St. Petersburg.
Wait, really? After all that paperwork?
Yep. A band of disgruntled military officers broke in, demanded his abdication, and when he resisted, they strangled and trampled him to death. It proves a fundamental, unavoidable political reality. Institutions and laws written on parchment are only as strong as the people enforcing them.
And they depend entirely on the loyalty of the military.
Exactly. Paul alienated the elite, and his paperwork could not save him.
That violent transition brings us into the 19th century pressure cooker. We are moving from 1825 to 1894. If you look at the broad arc of the 19th century in Russia, it is essentially a violent, agonizing pendulum swing between desperate attempts at reform and intense, crushing reactionary pushback.
The century begins with chaos. When Paul's eldest son, Alexander I, dies unexpectedly without a legitimate son in 1825, the transition is completely bungled.
How so?
His brother Constantine, who was next in line under the Pauline laws, had secretly renounced his right to the throne years earlier to marry a woman not of equal birth. So the crown legally falls to a younger brother, Nicholas I.
But no one knew about the secret renunciation.
Right. This secret renunciation causes mass confusion in the military ranks. This confusion provides the spark for the Decembrist revolt, where reform-minded military officers lead 3,000 troops into Senate Square in St. Petersburg, refusing to swear allegiance to Nicholas and demanding a constitution.
Nicholas surrounds them with loyal troops and artillery, and when they refuse to disperse, he opens fire.
Yes. Nicholas crushes the revolt with grapeshot, and that trauma defines his entire 30-year reign. He rules with an absolute iron fist, deeply fearful of the liberal revolution sweeping across Europe.
He clamps down hard.
He really does. He formulates an official state ideology: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. He creates a powerful secret police force, the Third Section, to monitor dissent, censor literature, and crush any whispers of reform. He tries to freeze Russia in time. But when he dies in 1855, amidst the disastrous logistical failures of the Crimean War, his son, Alexander II, inherits a fundamentally broken machine.
Alexander II looks at the empire and realizes it is rotting from the inside out. He decides that the only way to save the autocracy is to radically reform it. He modernizes the military, he overhauls the judicial system, and most famously, in 1861, he actually frees the serfs.
Which was a massive deal.
Huge. He legally undoes the defining central law of his ancestor, Alexis I. He emancipates over 23 million privately held serfs. He is hailed as the Great Liberator. But the mechanics of this liberation were deeply flawed.
It is vital to understand the mechanism of that emancipation. Alexander didn't just hand the peasants free land and wish them well. The state compensated the nobles for the land and then burdened the newly freed serfs with massive redemption payments spanning 49 years to pay the state back.
So they were free, but completely in debt.
Right. So while they were legally free, they were economically crippled and still tied to their village communes to ensure that debts were paid. It was a massive structural shock to the economy that left the peasants feeling cheated and the nobles feeling robbed of their wealth and status.
And while Alexander is trying to navigate this incredibly dangerous political tightrope, trying to save the empire, his family life becomes an absolute, highly public scandal. The family dynamics always deeply influenced how the court and the public perceived the Tsar's moral authority.
In an autocratic system, the Tsar's household is the state. There is no separation.
Right. So his wife, Empress Maria Alexandrovna, suffers terribly from tuberculosis. She spends most of her time abroad or confined to her rooms, physically wasting away. Alexander doesn't just take a casual mistress, which was somewhat expected of monarchs.
He takes it a step further.
He essentially sets up a parallel second family right inside the Winter Palace with a young noblewoman named Princess Catherine Dolgorukova. He has several children with her while his wife is dying in the same building. And when the Empress finally succumbs to tuberculosis in 1880, Alexander completely shocks the court.
He didn't even wait.
Nope, he doesn't wait the traditional year of mourning. Barely a month later, he enters into a morganatic marriage with Catherine.
And a morganatic marriage, in the context of European royalty and the Pauline laws, is a legal marriage. But because the wife is of unequal non-sovereign rank, neither she nor her children can claim the titles, privileges, or succession rights of the husband.
But the Russian elite are absolutely scandalized. The adult Grand Dukes and Duchesses, Alexander's legitimate children, are furious and humiliated. There are rampant, terrifying rumors buzzing through St. Petersburg that Alexander is preparing to crown this former mistress as empress and legitimize their bastard children, completely upending the succession.
Which is incredibly dangerous timing.
He is tearing the royal family apart at the exact moment he needs elite cohesion to survive the rising tide of radical terrorism.
And that radical terrorism is mounting. Despite his reforms, or perhaps because the reforms raised expectations without fully satisfying them, radical underground groups like Narodnaya Volya or the People's Will view Alexander II not as a liberator, but as a tyrant who must be eliminated.
Before Alexander II can enact a planned constitutional reform that might have allowed elected representatives a small voice in government, the pendulum swings back with brutal, tragic force. In March 1881, as his carriage travels along the Catherine Canal in St. Petersburg, a revolutionary throws a handmade bomb under the carriage.
He actually survives the first blast, right?
Yes, he survives the first blast, steps out into the smoke to check on the wounded guards, and a second assassin steps forward and hurls a second bomb directly at the Tsar's feet, blowing his legs off. He bleeds to death hours later in his study.
You have to consider the profound psychological and institutional impact of that assassination on his son, who now ascends as Alexander III.
Alexander III steps up to the throne, and he is the physical and ideological embodiment of a reactionary pendulum swing. The contemporary sources describe him as massive standing, 6'4", incredibly broad, supposedly strong enough to bend horseshoes with his bare hands.
He was an intimidating figure.
Unlike his refined European-leaning predecessors, he sports a huge traditional bushy beard. He looks and acts like a mythic medieval Tsar.
And his policy mirrors his physique. Heavy, immovable, and forceful. Terrified, traumatized, and enraged by his father's violent murder, Alexander III analyzes the situation and concludes that liberal reforms, the freeing of the serfs, the loosening of censorship, the talk of constitutions, do not pacify the public.
He thinks reform equals revolution.
Yes. He believes reform only breeds further revolution, so he violently reverses course. He issues the manifesto on unshakable autocracy, declaring his absolute unquestionable authority. He cranks the machinery of the police state up to maximum.
Like a total crackdown.
He massively expands the power of the Okhrana, the new secret police, to infiltrate and dismantle revolutionary cells. He mandates aggressive Russification policies across the empire, forcing the Russian language and Orthodox religion on minorities. He fundamentally believes that only brute strength, intense nationalism, and unyielding autocracy can hold the fragile, sprawling Russian empire together.
He believes the system cannot bend, so it must be made of iron. He also marries Princess Dagmar of Denmark, who takes the Orthodox name Maria Feodorovna. Unlike his father, they actually have a very harmonious, deeply loyal marriage.
They were very close.
They retreat to heavily guarded palaces outside the capital to stay safe. But Alexander III's iron grip is cut short. He dies relatively young, at 49, from severe kidney disease in 1894. And this sudden death brings us to the second and arguably fatal turning point of our deep dive, the era of hemophilia, isolation, and the mystic.
The transition of power in 1894 is, in retrospect, the beginning of the end. The system required a giant to hold it together, and it got a man utterly unsuited for the task.
Alexander's eldest son, Nicholas II, takes over the empire. Nicholas is 26, but he is completely overwhelmed. He famously breaks down and admits to a close friend, "I am not ready to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling."
It's tragic, honestly.
Just a week after his intimidating father's funeral, while the court is still draped in black mourning clothes, he marries his fiancée, Alex of Hesse. She is a minor German princess, but more importantly, she is a favorite granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria. She takes the Orthodox name Alexandra.
Alexandra's integration into the Russian court is disastrous from the start. She is naturally shy, prone to anxiety, and deeply serious.
And the Russian court loved to party.
Right. So the Russian elite perceive her as cold, arrogant, and severe, especially when compared to Nicholas's highly popular, socially adept mother, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna. Alexandra detests the gossip and frivolity of St. Petersburg society, and they in turn actively dislike her.
Nicholas, despite his admitted unpreparedness, is fiercely, stubbornly devoted to the autocratic principles of his father. He lacks his father's physical presence and force of will, but he tries to mimic his rigidity.
Which is a dangerous combination.
When representatives of local councils politely ask him to allow them a small voice in advising the throne, Nicholas dismisses their hopes as senseless dreams. He leaves his father's harsh, reactionary policies entirely intact. He completely ignores the massive tectonic social and industrial shifts happening in Russia at the turn of the 20th century.
The world was changing fast.
The population is migrating to cities, industrializing, demanding labor rights, and Nicholas is trying to rule like it's 1649.
That political rigidity was dangerous. But the fatal blow, the dynamic that truly seals their fate behind the heavy palace doors, is a deeply tragic genetic time bomb.
Through her grandmother, Queen Victoria, Alexandra is a silent carrier of the mutated gene for hemophilia B, a disease where the blood lacks the ability to clot properly. For years, the royal couple faces intense pressure to produce a male heir to secure the succession under the strict Pauline laws.
They had 4 daughters first, right?
Yeah. Yes, after having 4 healthy daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, they finally joyously welcome a male heir in 1904, Alexei. But their joy turns to absolute horror within months. They discover the boy has hemophilia.
We have to explain the brutal physical reality of this disease in the early 20th century, before modern clotting factor treatments. A minor stumble, a bump against a chair, a small bruise could cause agonizing, protracted internal bleeding.
It sounds so painful.
It was. Blood would pool into his joints, causing excruciating pressure and pain. A simple nosebleed could be a multi-day crisis that threatened his life.
And the institutional response to this immense, terrifying personal tragedy is where the Romanovs make a catastrophic error. To protect the dynasty's public image of divine strength, invulnerability, and genetic perfection, the Romanovs make the fateful decision to keep the heir's agonizing disease a massive, closely guarded state secret.
Only a very small circle knew.
Only a tiny inner circle of doctors and family members are allowed to know.
This is where the intersection of autocracy and family dynamics becomes lethal. Because the state is the family, a weakness in the heir is viewed as a weakness in the empire itself. But by hiding it, they isolate themselves completely from their own court and their subjects.
Driven absolutely mad by maternal anxiety, spending nights listening to her son scream in agony, praying for death to take him to stop the pain, Alexandra turns away from the useless court doctors. She turns to the occult, to extreme religious fervor, to anyone who can offer a shred of hope.
Enter Grigori Rasputin.
Enter Rasputin. He is a peasant from Siberia, a wandering mystic who has built a reputation in St. Petersburg as a holy man with healing powers.
The turning point for Rasputin's influence happens in 1912. The royal family is at their hunting lodge in Spala, in modern-day Poland. Alexei suffers a severe hemorrhage in his thigh and groin.
This was the really bad one.
Yes. The internal bleeding is so massive, he is screaming in agony, his heartbeat is failing, and the doctors officially give up. They literally draft the boy's public obituary and inform the government to prepare for his death. In sheer desperation, Alexandra sends a telegram to Rasputin, who is back in Siberia.
What does he say?
Rasputin wires back a message. God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much.
And amazingly, almost inexplicably, the very next day, Alexei's bleeding stops. He begins to recover. Historians and doctors debate how this happened. Did Rasputin's advice stop the doctors from administering aspirin, which is a blood thinner they were likely using for pain?
That's a strong theory.
Did the telegram calm the mother, which calmed the boy and lowered his blood pressure, or was it just sheer coincidental timing? Whenever the mechanism, the result is absolute. To Alexandra, Rasputin is a living saint sent by God to protect the Romanov dynasty.
From that moment in 1912, Rasputin becomes their indispensable spiritual advisor and the absolute, unquestioned gatekeeper to the Tsar and Tsarina.
Let's break down the political catastrophe this creates. Because of the obsessive secrecy surrounding the hemophilia, The Russian public and the nobility have absolutely no idea why Rasputin is there.
Right, they just see this strange peasant.
They don't see a desperate, terrified mother turning to a faith healer to save her dying child. They see the autocratic emperor and empress of the Russian Empire being puppeted, manipulated, and influenced by a dirty, lecherous, scandalous peasant who boasts about his power over them. It completely erodes the moral and cultural authority of the monarchy.
It was a disaster for their image.
See, I look at this dynamic and I would passionately argue that Rasputin, and specifically the hemophilia cover-up that enabled him, were the ultimate cause of the Romanovs' downfall.
You think it was the primary cause?
I do. The entire basis of their power, going all the way back to Tsar Mikhail weeping in the Ipatiev monastery in 1613, was the sacrality of the monarchy. The Tsar was divinely appointed, a father figure to the peasants. By allowing this charlatan to essentially dictate palace access, fire capable ministers who opposed him, and flaunt his influence, Nicholas and Alexandra severed that mystical cultural legitimacy.
They lost the aura.
They looked weak and corrupt in the eyes of the peasants, and they deeply alienated the conservative nobles who were so disgusted they eventually assassinated Rasputin themselves in late 1916. The family's private drama entirely destroyed the mythology that kept the state alive.
I understand the appeal of that narrative, but I have to respectfully push back on it. Was Rasputin a horrific PR disaster? Absolutely. Did the secrecy breed fatal, toxic rumors that Alexandra was a German spy or having an affair with a peasant?
Yeah.
Yes. But the real forces that killed the Romanov dynasty were institutional, economic, and political. The system was simply too archaic, too inflexible to survive the crushing realities of the 20th century. Consider the timeline. Rasputin didn't cause the disastrous Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, an imperial overreach that ended in humiliating defeat and exposed massive Russian military incompetence. Rasputin didn't order imperial troops to open fire on thousands of unarmed, peaceful protesters who were simply begging the Tsar for better working conditions in 1905, an event known as Bloody Sunday, which permanently shattered the image of the Tsar as a benevolent father.
Okay, that is a fair assessment of the structural failures before Rasputin's peak influence.
And most critically, Rasputin didn't force Nicholas II to make the single most fatal decision of his reign. In 1915, during the meat grinder of World War I, Nicholas decides to leave the capital and take personal, direct command of the Russian army at the front lines.
Oh, that was a huge mistake.
A catastrophic mistake. It tied the Tsar directly, personally, to every single military defeat, supply shortage, and logistical failure. And worse, it left his deeply unpopular German-born wife, and by extension, Rasputin, in charge of the daily bureaucracy of the government in the capital during a total war against Germany.
Which didn't go well.
The ministers were fired and replaced based on Rasputin's whims. The supply chains for food and fuel into the cities completely collapsed. You cannot fight a modern, industrialized world war with an archaic, 17th century autocratic apparatus.
The structure was just too brittle.
The family drama was a highly visible symptom of the rot, but it just accelerated the inevitable collapse of a structure that was already structurally doomed.
When you lay out the logistics like that, the collapse feels entirely inevitable. Which brings us to the harrowing reality of Act 15, the final bitter end of the dynasty. Let's trace how that structural collapse actually played out on the ground in 1917.
By the bitter winter of early 1917, the sheer strain of World War I completely breaks Russia. The transportation network fails. There are massive, crippling food and coal shortages in the capital, now renamed Petrograd.
People were starving.
Women line up for hours in freezing temperatures for bread that isn't there. Riots break out. This is the February Revolution. Nicholas orders the military garrison to crush the protests, just as they had in 1905.
But it doesn't work this time.
No. But this time, the mechanism of autocracy fails. The soldiers, many of them tired, starving conscripts themselves, refuse to fire on the crowds. The garrison mutinies and joins the revolution. Without the military, the autocracy evaporates.
It's just gone.
Nicholas's own generals and ministers advise him that the only way to save Russia and keep the country in the war is for him to step down. On March 15, 1917, trapped on a royal train, Nicholas II abdicates. He initially tries to pass the throne to his son Alexei, but realizing the boy's health couldn't withstand it, he abdicates in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael.
And Michael declines, right?
Michael wisely defers accepting the crown, unless it's offered by an elected assembly. And just like that, 304 years of Romanov rule is simply over.
A provisional government takes over the state apparatus. They initially place Nicholas, Alexandra, and the 5 kids under relatively comfortable house arrest in one of their palaces. They eventually move the family to Siberia, to the town of Tobolsk, supposedly for their own safety as the political situation in the capital radicalizes.
But the provisional government doesn't last.
No, the provisional government is weak. They make the fatal decision to keep Russia in World War I, which continues to bleed the country dry. And in November 1917, Vladimir Lenin and the radical Bolsheviks launched the October Revolution, seizing control of the government.
To understand what happens next, we have to look at the geopolitical context as neutrally and factually as possible. By the spring of 1918, Russia is engulfed in a multi-front, incredibly brutal civil war.
Red versus white.
Yes. You have the anti-Bolshevik forces, collectively known as the White Army, which is a loose coalition of monarchists, conservatives, liberals, and foreign allied troops. They are actively advancing against the Bolshevik Red Army. In April 1918, the Bolshevik authorities decide to move the Romanovs from Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg, a heavily industrialized, fiercely Bolshevik stronghold in the Ural Mountains.
And where do they put them?
They place the family in a requisitioned property owned by a military engineer named Ipedev, the Itev house. They surround it with high wooden palisades, paint the windows white so the family can't look out, and place them under heavy hostile guard.
As the summer progresses, the situation becomes critical for the Bolsheviks. The White Army, particularly the Czechoslovak Legion, is advancing rapidly on Yekaterinburg. The local Ural Soviet authorities, communicating with Lenin in Moscow, realize that the royal family is simply too dangerous of a political and symbolic asset to let live.
They couldn't risk a rescue.
If the White Army liberates Nicholas, he becomes a massive rallying point. If they liberate the children, the dynasty has a future. So we arrive at the deeply harrowing night of July 16th, crossing into July 17th, 1918.
The mechanics of the execution were chaotic and brutal.
In the middle of the night, the family is abruptly woken up by the commandant, Yakov Yurovsky, Nicholas, Alexandra, the 4 daughters, the 13-year-old hemophiliac son, Alexei, who actually had to be carried by his father because his legs were crippled from a recent bleed, and 4 loyal servants.
They tell them they're being moved for safety.
Right. They are told that fighting is approaching the town and they are being moved down to the basement for their own physical safety. They are led down into a small, bare, semi-basement cellar room. Alexandra requests 2 chairs, one for herself, one for Alexei. They arrange themselves, believing they are waiting for transport or perhaps for a photograph to be taken to prove to Moscow they are still alive.
Instead of photographer, Yurovsky and a squad of heavily armed secret police file into the small room. Yurovsky hastily reads a brief statement declaring that because their relatives in Europe are continuing to attack Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decreed their execution.
Nicholas barely has time to turn and ask what before Yurovsky shoots him point blank in the chest. The squad immediately opens fire in the confined, smoke-filled room. But it doesn't end quickly. The bullets start ricocheting wildly around the room. The executioners realize, to their horror, that the bullets are bouncing off the bodies of the Grand Duchesses.
The reason for this is deeply tragic. In preparation for a hopeful escape, the royal women had spent weeks secretly sewing the bulk of the family's remaining diamonds and precious jewels tightly into the linings of their corsets.
Oh, wow. So they acted like armor.
In the dim cellar, these heavy, jewel-encrusted corsets acted as makeshift bulletproof armor.
Because the gunfire isn't working, the room fills with thick cordite smoke, deafening noise, and screams. The executioners resort to using their bayonets and the butts of their rifles to finish the job in a horrific, prolonged melee. By the end, all 11 people in the room are dead.
The decision to execute the entire family, including the children and the servants, was almost certainly made with the prior knowledge and tacit approval of Vladimir Lenin and the central leadership in Moscow, although the Bolsheviks took great care to ensure the paper trail remained ambiguous to maintain plausible deniability on the international stage.
It is an incredibly horrific, messy end. But what makes the tragedy even more agonizing for the next century is the deliberate, highly orchestrated Soviet misinformation campaign that immediately followed the murders.
The handling of the narrative was deeply cynical and politically motivated. The Bolsheviks were currently negotiating a vital peace treaty with Germany, and Alexandra and the children had close German royal ties.
So they lied.
So initially, the Soviet press officially claimed that only Nicholas II had been executed, and that the Empress and the children had been evacuated to a safe place. Then, as rumors spread in 1919, they shifted the narrative, claiming the murders were carried out by rogue, uncontrollable left-wing revolutionaries not associated with the central Bolshevik command.
Shifting the blame.
By 1922, they were deliberately confusing the timeline and denying the deaths entirely in certain diplomatic circles. This massive state-sponsored lying created a vacuum of truth that lasted for a century.
And the executioners went to extreme macabre lengths to hide the physical evidence of their crime. The sources detail how Yurovsky's men initially stripped the bodies, finding the jewels, and planned to throw the corpses down a flooded mineshaft in the forest.
But that plan fell apart.
Right. Word got out to the locals. Realizing the grave would be discovered, they hastily pulled the bodies back up, loaded them onto a truck, and tried to move them deeper into the woods. The truck got stuck in the mud. Desperate, they tried to burn a few of the bodies, severely doused the rest in sulfuric acid to destroy their faces and prevent future identification, and finally buried them in a shallow, unmarked pit right in the middle of the dirt road, burying it with logs so carts would just drive over it.
Which leads perfectly into the final phase of our deep dive. The aftermath, the enduring myths, and the staggering wealth. Because the state's secrecy, the lack of a public funeral, and the missing bodies created an enormous psychological vacuum. And human nature abhors a vacuum. It was quickly filled with myths of survival.
For decades, there was this desperate romantic hope in the West that someone somehow had survived that cellar. Specifically, the youngest daughter, Anastasia. The 1920s saw a massive phenomenon of imposters popping up in Europe, claiming to be Romanov survivors suffering from amnesia.
Anna Anderson being the most famous.
The most famous and convincing of these was a woman known as Anna Anderson. She appeared in Berlin after attempting suicide. She had scars, she vaguely resembled the Grand Duchess, and she seemed to possess intimate knowledge of the Russian court. She fooled a surprising number of people, including some distant Romanov relatives, former servants, and members of the European aristocracy, who supported her right up until her death in 1984.
But the grim reality was eventually uncovered through a combination of amateur persistence and modern genetic science. In 1979, amateur Russian historians, using secretly declassified documents, actually found the unmarked muddy grave near Yekaterinburg.
But they didn't tell anyone right away.
No. They dug up 3 skulls, realized what they had found, and out of fear of the KGB, reburied them and kept the discovery completely secret until the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. The grave was officially and publicly excavated in 1991. However, they only found 9 bodies. 2 were missing.
Alexei and one of the girls.
Right. It wasn't until 2007 that a second, much smaller grave was found nearby, containing the burned, fragmentary remains of Alexei and one of his sisters, likely Maria, though some argue Anastasia.
How did they prove definitively that these bones in the mud were the imperial family?
Through mitochondrial DNA testing. Scientists extracted DNA from the bones and compared it to living relatives. Crucially, they used a blood sample from Prince Philip, the late Duke of Edinburgh, who was a direct maternal descendant of Alexandra's family.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Mitochondrial DNA, which passes unchanged from mother to child, was an exact match. The remains were positively identified. Furthermore, in 1994, DNA testing was performed on medical tissues saved from Anna Anderson. It proved definitively that she was not a Romanov. She was a missing Polish factory worker with a history of mental illness named Franziska Szankowska. Science firmly closed the door on the fairy tale.
It puts a very harsh, definitive end to the myth. But let's pivot and talk about the money, because the sheer wealth the Romanovs accumulated over 300 years is almost impossible to comprehend. We have financial sources here detailing their assets just prior to the revolution.
It's a staggering amount.
The imperial family received an annual government appropriation of 11 million gold rubles. To put that in context, that equates to hundreds of thousands of ounces of pure gold every single year, just as an allowance. The private estates, palaces, and lands belonging directly to the family were valued at over $50 million back then, billions in today's money. And that doesn't even touch the staggering value of the Romanov family jewelry.
The crown jewels of the Russian Empire were legendary. Orbs, scepters, diamond crowns, Fabergé eggs. When the Bolsheviks took over, they seized everything they could find. Some jewelry had been smuggled out by fleeing relatives, but the bulk was locked in the Kremlin.
Did they keep it?
Interestingly, the young Soviet state was desperate for foreign currency to buy tractors and industrial equipment. In 1927, they actually held an auction in London and sold off a significant portion of the lesser Russian crown jewels to Western buyers.
So the immediate ruling family is dead. The immense wealth is scattered across Europe or seized by the state, but the Romanovs aren't entirely erased from the earth. The genealogical databases note that out of 65 members of the extended House of Romanov living in 1917, uncles, cousins, distant nephews, 47 of them managed to survive the revolution.
Many fled on British warships or escaped through the southern borders into lifelong exile.
Right.
And the existence of these survivors creates a fascinating, almost absurd epilogue to the institutional history of the family. Even today, in the 21st century, you have wealthy descendants actively claiming the headship of a completely non-existent throne. The two most prominent current claimants are Grand Duchess Maria Vladimirovna, who lives in Spain, and Prince Karl Emich of Leiningen, a German aristocrat.
And how are they legally fighting this battle over a ghost empire?
They're using the exact same mechanisms we discussed earlier. They're using the Pauline laws. The very laws that Paul Alcuin frantically wrote in 1797 to prevent his sons from assassinating each other are now being cited in modern press releases to argue over who is the legitimate heir to an empire that fell over a century ago.
That's wild.
Supporters of Karl Emich argue that Maria Vladimirovna's claim is invalid because her parents' marriage violated the equal birth requirements of the Pauline laws. They argue her mother was from the House of Gresham-Mukrani, an ancient Georgian noble family, but one that didn't possess technically sovereign status at the time of the marriage.
So they're arguing over technicalities.
It is a stunning historical irony. They are strictly applying 18th century autocratic legal codes to a 21st century dispute over a phantom crown.
It really is the ultimate irony. They lost the empire because they couldn't adapt, and they're still refusing to adapt. So, synthesizing this incredible, bloody journey we've been on today, the Romanovs were a family that forged a sprawling modern empire out of the sheer chaos and starvation of the time of troubles. They used brilliant, albeit brutal, legal and cultural mechanisms to manufacture legitimacy. But their absolute stubborn inability to separate their personal family dramas from the rigid institutions of state power eventually led to their total annihilation. They built a massive, unyielding, autocratic machine that they eventually couldn't control, and when it broke, it crushed them.
The core tragedy is that they fundamentally believed that rigid autocracy was the only glue that could hold the diverse, massive Russian landmass together.
Yeah.
In the end, their absolute refusal to let that autocracy bend meant they guaranteed it would violently shatter.
Which leaves you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. Throughout this entire deep dive, we've seen how the Romanovs relied on archaic, inflexible structures, whether it was the rigid Pauline laws, the brutal enshrinement of serfdom, or the absolute mystical power of the Tsar to protect their dynasty.
Right.
But what if they had managed to adapt? What if, instead of hiding Alexei's hemophilia behind the walls of autocratic secrecy and Rasputin's dangerous mysticism, Nicholas II had taken a different path? What if he had voluntarily transitioned Russia into a constitutional monarchy?
A completely different timeline.
If he had shared power with an elected parliament, allowed democratic institutions to handle the crises of poverty and war, and stepped back into a symbolic role, could a Romanov monarch still be sitting in a palace in St. Petersburg today as a ceremonial head of state, cutting ribbons and hosting state dinners, much like their royal cousins still do in the UK?
It is a profound question about the nature of power. Does surviving require gripping the sword tighter or knowing when to put it down?
304 years. From a terrified teenager weeping in the Apadiev monastery to a terrified family murdered in the smoke of the Apadiev house, history has a long, unforgiving memory. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you hear because the documented truth is always deeper and much wilder than the myth.